There is a specific kind of hunger that has nothing to do with food. Valerie Hartley learned that early. She was 9 years old the first time she really understood how little they had. She was sitting at the kitchen table in their apartment on the east side of Youngstown, dragging a piece of white bread through a saucer of vegetable oil her mother had sprinkled with salt. That was dinner. Not a side dish. Dinner. Val ate it slowly, the way you eat when you know there isn't more coming, and she didn't complain. Because even at 9, she understood that complaining would only make her mother's face do that thing, that quiet collapse behind the eyes that Susan Hartley tried so hard to hide from her daughter and never quite could. Val's father David had died in Afghanistan before she was old enough to have a real memory of him. What she had instead were objects. A folded flag in a triangle case on the shelf above the television. A shoebox on the top of her mother's closet that held his medals and his commendation papers. Susan kept the box out of reach, not to hide it from Val, but because she couldn't look at it often and function. Val knew it was there. On the nights when the apartment felt especially quiet, she would sometimes take it down and open it and read the documents inside by the light from the hallway. The language was formal and military and hard to parse, but one line she had memorized: Sergeant First Class David Hartley distinguished himself by conspicuous gallantry at the cost of his own life. She didn't fully understand what that meant when she was 9. She understood it better as she got older. She put the box back on the shelf each time and didn't tell her mother she'd been reading it. Susan loved her daughter with everything she had. The problem was that everything she had kept getting smaller. She had a condition that attacked her joints and her energy and her immune system in rotations that no doctor ever fully got ahead of. And the practical consequence was a life lived in cycles: a few months of work, then a flare, then FMLA, then the call from HR that said they were going in a different direction. Then the scramble to find something new before the savings ran out. The savings always ran out. Val grew up with a precise internal sense of where they stood at any given moment, the way some kids grow up knowing the weather. At school she was the kid in the wrong clothes. Not dramatically wrong. Susan made sure everything was clean, but wrong in the way that other girls at that age can identify from across the cafeteria. The jacket that was a season behind. The sneakers that were the off-brand version of what everyone else was wearing. Kids notice these things with a clarity that adults lose, and the girls in Val's class noticed, and Val learned to keep her eyes on her desk and her lunch and the clock above the door. There is something it does to a child growing up knowing there is never quite enough, not bitterness, exactly, more like a permanent low-grade bracing. A posture of the soul. Val carried it without knowing she carried it. Susan Hartley died 2 weeks after Val turned 14. There was no sudden crisis, no emergency room scene with machines and running footsteps. She had been sick for so long that when she finally stopped getting better, it happened the way a candle goes out. One moment there was a flame and then there wasn't. Val came home from school on a Thursday afternoon in October, and her mother was gone and the apartment was very quiet, and that was that. A caseworker came the next morning. Within the week arrangements had been made. Val would go live with her mother's older sister Claudette Briggs, who lived 20 minutes away, and had said yes when asked. Val packed her things into 2 garbage bags. Before she zipped up the second one, she went to Susan's closet and took the shoebox off the top shelf and put it in the bag herself. She wasn't going to leave that behind. Claudette Briggs was Susan's older sister, which meant she shared some of Susan's features: the same wide forehead, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking, but none of Susan's warmth. Val noticed that within the first hour. Claude didn't hug her when she arrived. She looked at the 2 garbage bags pointed down the hallway and said the back bedroom was hers and she'd need to start on dishes after she unpacked. That was the welcome. The arrangement revealed itself quickly. Claude was on disability for a back injury and had decided that Val's presence in her home was sufficient payment for everything the house required. Val was 14. She did the dishes, mopped the floors, learned to cook simple things, because if she didn't cook they didn't eat. Claude's disability check came on the 1st of the month, and was mostly gone by the 10th. Scratch tickets, small debts to neighbors, and wine from Deborah Nolan's convenience store, 6 blocks away, where Claude kept a running tab that Val was sent to service with handwritten notes when the cash ran out. Val made that walk so many times she knew every crack in the sidewalk. She knew that Deborah would always smile at her a little too warmly, the smile of someone who has been told things about you and is making assessments. It took about a year before the shape of the plan became clear. Claude started mentioning Deborah's son Brandon the way people mention things they want you to think are casual. He's responsible. He works hard. He's looking to settle down. Val was 15, then 16, and she understood what was being suggested even if no one said it directly. If Val and Brandon got together, Claude's tab at the store would effectively disappear. The wine would keep coming. Claude had solved her financial problem with her dead sister's daughter and seemed to feel genuinely good about it. Val sat through these conversations without responding. She did what was asked. She kept her room clean. She made the walk to Deborah's store. She also started keeping a jar under the loose floorboard at the foot of her bed quarters from change she wasn't asked to account for a few dollars here and there. Whatever she could set aside without Claude noticing. She didn't have a specific plan yet. She just knew she might need one. The night everything changed was 3 weeks before Val turned 18. Claude had been drinking since late afternoon, and by dinner she wasn't bothering to soften anything anymore. She looked across the table at Val and said it plainly. Deborah had been carrying this tab for 2 years. Brandon was a good opportunity that wasn't going to wait forever, and frankly, after everything Claude had done, taking in a kid she didn't have to take and putting a roof over her head all these years, the least Val could do was stop being so selfish about it. She said the word selfish slowly, like she wanted it to land somewhere specific. Val looked at her aunt's face and felt something settle in her chest. Not anger. Clarity. She said quietly, "I'm not going to solve your problems by marrying someone I don't know." Then she pushed back her chair and walked to her room. She closed the door and stood in the middle of the room for 4 seconds. Then she started moving. She pulled one garbage bag from the bottom of her closet and filled it fast, everything that fit, which wasn't much. She pried up the floorboard and counted out the jar on the mattress. $412. Coins and small bills, 2 years of careful invisibility. She put the money in her jacket pocket. Then she took the shoebox down from the shelf. David Hartley's medals. His commendation papers. The document with the line she had memorized. She put the shoebox in the bag last on top where it wouldn't get crushed. Some things you don't put at the bottom. Claude was still talking from the living room when Val walked down the hallway with both bags and opened the front door. She didn't slam it. She pulled it shut behind her with a quiet click and stood on the front step in the cold, and the relief that hit her was so sharp it almost felt like pain. She sat on the step and searched her phone for a room rental in Youngstown. She found a listing posted 3 days earlier. Ruth Engel. Back bedroom, private entrance. $120 a month, utilities included. Quiet house. Val texted. Ruth responded in 11 minutes. She could come tonight if she needed to. It took Val 20 minutes to walk there, one bag over each shoulder. Ruth Engel's house was a small pale yellow 2-story on a residential street, porch light on. The woman who opened the door was in her 70s, white hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked at Val. She looked at the 2 garbage bags. She looked at Val again. "Come in," she said. "I'll put on water." Val stepped inside and felt for the first time in 4 years like she might actually be able to breathe. She had $412 and no plan beyond tomorrow. But she had walked out of Claude's house on her own terms. And that was the first real thing she had done for herself in longer than she could remember. In the morning she would need a job. She would need one fast. By Thursday of that first week at Ruth's, Val had gone through every listing in the free jobs paper. Ruth kept in a stack by the door. Most required a degree or certification or experience Val didn't have. One didn't. Callaway Group Regional Office, Youngstown. Janitorial and cleaning staff. Immediate hire. Apply in person. She took the bus across town Friday morning and was hired the same afternoon. The woman in HR slid a contract across the desk and Val signed it without reading past the first paragraph. She needed the job. She started Monday. The Callaway Group office occupied the 2nd floor of a commercial building off Market Street, open floor plan, rows of desks, the kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look slightly unwell. Val arrived at 7 with her cleaning cart and kept her head down. For the first hour no one paid much attention to her. Then the rest of the staff filtered in, and one of them was Mariella Voss. Mariella was the kind of beautiful that announced itself. Dark hair, sharp jaw, the posture of someone who had decided long ago that every room she walked into was hers. She came through the door already talking to someone behind her and stopped mid-sentence when she saw Val. 30 seconds, that was all it took. She looked at Val's shoes, worn-down flats from Goodwill with the left one creased across the toe, then at her jacket, a gray zip-up washed so many times it had lost its original shape. Then she smiled at the person she'd been talking to and said loud enough for the nearest 6 desks to hear that she hoped the new cleaning girl knew the break room was off limits during business hours. Because some people actually needed to work in this office. A few people laughed. Val moved her cart to the far end of the room and kept mopping. 2 desks from the door a guy named Jason Mercer watched the whole thing without laughing. He leaned over to the guy next to him and said quietly that she looked like Cinderella. He meant it as a compliment. Neither of them said anything to Val or to Mariella. Jason went back to his screen. Val worked her shift. She came back Tuesday, Wednesday. She arrived before most of the staff and left after almost all of them because cleaning hours ran later than office hours. On Wednesday evening, Jason caught up with her in the parking lot while she waited for the bus and asked if she wanted to grab coffee nearby before heading home. Val almost said no out of reflex. She said yes instead. They went to a diner 2 blocks over and stayed an hour and a half. Jason was easy to talk to, asked questions, and listened to the answers made her laugh twice. Walking to the bus stop afterward, Val thought she couldn't remember the last time she'd spent an hour talking to someone without the conversation costing her something. The next morning, before she'd gotten her cart out of the supply room, one of Mariella's friends pulled Val into the hallway and delivered the information in 1 paragraph. Jason Mercer was Mariella's boyfriend. 2 years. Basically engaged. If Mariella found out Val had gone anywhere with him, she would make Val's life in this office something she would not want to continue experiencing. The friend said it not unkindly, the way someone warns you about a wet floor. Then she went back to her desk. Mariella already knew. Val understood that the moment she walked in and saw Mariella standing near the center of the room with her coffee cup and a specific smile, the smile of someone who has already decided how the next 10 minutes are going to go. She waited until enough people were listening, then started narrating Val's outfit to the room. The jacket had a real vintage quality. She asked if anyone knew which thrift store carried that particular shade of gray. She moved on to the shoes, said the crease across the toe gave them real character. She called the whole ensemble a look delivered with the kind of warmth that meant its exact opposite. People laughed. Jason looked at his screen. There is something distinctly worse about cruelty that arrives smiling. Anger you can brace against. Contempt dressed as humor gets under your skin differently because part of you stays aware that the people laughing might not even know they're doing damage. Val pushed her cart to the back hallway and did not let her face do anything she would regret. She found Martin at the end of that first week on Friday afternoon. She'd gone to the supply closet for a replacement mop head, and there he was, a white kitten maybe 4 weeks old, sitting on the bottom shelf and looking up at her with the patience of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. She checked the hallway, tucked him inside her jacket, zipped it halfway, and finished her shift with him warm against her ribs. He didn't make a sound the whole bus ride home. Ruth looked at the kitten and said he could stay as long as he used the litter box and she'd pick one up tomorrow. Val named him Martin that night, sitting on her bed with him curled in the hollow of her crossed legs, and thought that for everything this week had cost her, at least she hadn't come home to an empty room. By the end of her 2nd week, Val had decided to quit. The mockery had settled into a daily rhythm, Mariella finding something new each morning, the office responding the way offices do when one person controls the temperature of the room. Even people who didn't participate had stopped making eye contact with Val when it happened. She'd started dreading coming in, and that dread was costing her sleep she couldn't afford to lose. So on Monday morning of week 3, she went to HR before her shift and told the rep she needed to resign effective immediately. The rep pulled up her file and turned the monitor so Val could see the contract. She pointed to a clause halfway down. If an employee in the janitorial or facilities category terminated employment before completing 30 calendar days of work, all accrued wages for that period would be forfeited. It was written in the language of something designed to be skipped by someone who needs a job badly enough to sign fast. Val had signed fast. The rep said she was sorry that it wasn't a policy she designed personally, but that it was what it was. Val thanked her and went to get her cart. That night she counted what was left in the jar. $83. 2 weeks of bus fare and groceries had taken most of the $400. Martin needed food by Wednesday. Rent was due in 10 days. She did the math 3 times and got the same answer. She could not leave without that paycheck. She had to finish the 30 days. Mariella, sensing something had shifted in Val's silence, it had gone from enduring to simply impenetrable, responded by escalating. The comments came earlier in the day now. She discussed Val's cleaning technique with the tone of someone making pleasant small talk. She examined the age of Val's shoes with the interest of an antiques appraiser. One afternoon she asked the room whether the gray jacket was the same one from last week or a different one from the same collection. The room laughed. Jason laughed briefly, then looked at his desk with the focus of a man pretending he hadn't just done what he'd done. Val pushed the cart down the hall, and did not look back. The quarterly walkthrough happened on a Thursday afternoon near the end of week 3. Val heard the shift in the office's ambient noise, the particular settling that happens when someone important walks in. She was working the far row of desks when she saw Nick Calloway come through the door. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, heavyset but straight back, the posture of someone told for years to stand a certain way until it simply became how he stood. He moved through the room like someone checking on things not performing for them. Mariella was on her feet before he'd made it 10 steps. She crossed the floor with a smile she kept specifically for people whose opinions had consequences. She said it had been too long. She said the office missed having him around. She walked alongside him toward her section of the floor, and in that stretch she caught her elbow on the paper coffee cup on her armrest and the cup went over. Coffee spread across the floor in a slow dark fan. Without breaking stride or changing her expression, Mariella moved her foot and nudged the empty cup under her desk and out of sight. She did it the way you do something you've rehearsed. Then she stopped, looked down at the stain and looked up at Nick with the patience of someone who has raised this issue before and hasn't been heard. She said this was actually a good example. The cleaning staff hadn't been keeping up, her workspace got skipped. She'd raised it internally without results. She gestured at the stain like evidence. She didn't look at Val once. Nick looked at the stain. Then he looked at Val standing 12 feet away with her hands on the mop handle, watching all of it happen in real time. His expression gave nothing away. He said, "Come see me in the conference room." There is nothing quite like standing in front of someone who holds all the power when you have no evidence and no allies and no version of the story that doesn't sound like exactly what the other person wants it to sound like. Val set the mop against the wall and followed him down the hall. The conference room was small and plain, a table, 6 chairs, a whiteboard with something half erased from a previous meeting. Nick sat on one side and gestured for Val to take the chair across from him. No notepad. No phone. He just looked at her. He said the office had complaints about the cleaning work. He'd seen the state of the main floor himself. He wasn't raising his voice. He was presenting what he understood to be the situation and giving her the opportunity to respond. The way someone does after enough of these conversations to know the first version is rarely the whole one. Val looked at the table for 1 second. Then she looked at him. She said she didn't know where the stain came from because she hadn't made it. She said Mariella Voss had been hostile toward her since the first morning, daily and consistent, and that based on what she had seen with her own eyes that afternoon, she believed the coffee had been knocked over deliberately. She said it in a level voice without apologizing for saying it. She wasn't performing confidence she didn't feel. She was just tired enough that the careful version of herself had stopped showing up. Nick studied her for a moment. Then he asked her name. She said Valerie Hartley. He asked her to say the last name again. She said Hartley. And then, because something in his stillness told her the full answer was the right answer, she said, "My father was David Hartley. Sergeant First Class. He died in Afghanistan. I have his commendation papers at home. I've read them so many times I have parts memorized. I just know he didn't come back." Nick Calloway stopped moving. Not the way people stop when surprised, the way people stop when something reaches them below the surface where the reflexes don't operate. He asked the unit. She gave him the number from the papers. He sat back in his chair and said the name quietly to himself. David Hartley. Then he told her. Not all of it, some. He kept the way people keep the parts that still cost something to say out loud. There had been a position under fire. A stretch of open ground nobody should have been on. Nick had been hit and couldn't move, and the survivable thing would have been to stay low and wait. David Hartley had not done the survivable thing. He had come out into the open and pulled Nick back to cover and taken a round doing it. Nick had made it out. David had not. Nick had thought about that day more times than he could count across 15 years. The room was quiet for a long time. Val didn't fill the silence. She wasn't sure she could have spoken if she'd tried. Finally Nick said, "Go back to work. I'll handle the rest." She didn't know what that meant until 2 hours later when she heard through the HR office door the specific tone of a conversation that ends a job. Mariella Voss came out 15 minutes after that, collected her bag without making eye contact with anyone, and left. No speech. She didn't look at Val. Val's first paycheck came at the end of that week. She opened the envelope on the bus ride home because she couldn't wait. The amount was more than she'd calculated, a bonus attached that nearly doubled the check, no explanation beyond the word supplemental. She folded it back into the envelope and held it in both hands and looked out the window at Youngstown going past in the late afternoon gray. She thought about a man she had never really known who had carried his name into a moment he didn't survive, and whose name had just done something for her she hadn't been able to do for herself. We carry things without knowing why. A shoebox on a shelf. A name on a document. Sometimes what we've been carrying turns out to be exactly what we needed to have with us all along. That evening she stopped at the grocery store and bought Martin 2 cans with the salmon on the label, the ones he'd been approving of lately. She paid cash and had money left over. It was the first time in 3 weeks that had been true. She didn't know yet that Nick Calloway wasn't finished. Monday morning Val arrived at the office and found someone else already running the vacuum down the main corridor, an older woman moving through the space with the efficiency of someone who had done this at a dozen offices and would do it at a dozen more. Val stood in the entrance for a moment, cartless for the first time since she'd started. Then HR called her name from down the hall. New contract on the desk. Client Communications Associate. Fixed hours 8 to 5. A desk near the east window. A real salary. The rep slid it across. Val read every paragraph before she picked up the pen. Nick came back Friday afternoon, stopped by her desk, said she was settling in, and asked if she had a few minutes. Same conference room, different feeling entirely. He slid 2 keys across the table. He owned an apartment 12 blocks from the office, 3 bedrooms, bought years ago for a future that hadn't happened yet, sitting empty ever since. An empty property was a liability. Someone who worked for him shouldn't be renting a room by the month. He said it wasn't charity. He said it the way someone says something practical when the real reason isn't something they're going to put into words on a Friday afternoon. Val looked at the keys. She asked if she could bring her cat. It was the first time she saw Nick Calloway laugh. It changed his face entirely, took years off it. Made him look briefly like someone who had once moved through the world more easily than he'd since allowed himself. She gave Ruth Engel 2 days' notice, which felt insufficient for someone who had opened a door at 9 at night to a girl with 2 garbage bags and put the kettle on without asking questions. She stopped by Sunday evening with a card and a small plant she'd seen Ruth looking at in a store window once. Ruth held her hand on the front step and said she'd always known Val would be fine. Not as a pleasantry. As a statement of observed fact. Val moved in that Sunday with Martin in his carrier, the 2 garbage bags and the shoebox. The apartment was clean and quiet and larger than anywhere she had ever lived. She put the shoebox on the bedroom shelf where she could see it from the bed. Martin investigated every room in under 4 minutes and selected the sunniest corner of the living room as his settling into it with the air of someone who had always intended to end up exactly here. That first night after Martin was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Val sat on the floor of the living room with her back against the couch and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The feeling in her chest wasn't simple. There was relief, yes, and something close to gratitude that she didn't have a clean word for. But there was also something quieter underneath, a strange vertigo that comes when your life changes faster than your nervous system can process. She thought about her mother, about the apartment on the east side where the heat sometimes didn't work in January. About all the versions of a future she had stopped herself from imagining because imagining felt dangerous when the present was this precarious. She wasn't unhappy. She just needed a moment to let all of it be real. She sat there until the feeling settled and then she went to bed. The following week Nick told her she was enrolling at Youngstown State in the fall. Economics. He didn't frame it as a question, he told her, then asked if she had any objections. She thought for 3 seconds. She didn't. He'd already spoken to admissions. Tuition was handled. She would keep her hours and adjust her schedule around classes. Val had spent 4 years being told there was no money for school, that the ceiling was low and she should get comfortable with it. Sitting across from Nick while he explained the enrollment timeline, she felt the specific sensation of a door opening in a wall she'd been told was solid. Jason found her in the break room 2 weeks after that. He'd split from Mariella. The news had moved through the floor the way office news moves, and he came in with the energy of someone who has rehearsed an opening line. He said maybe they could get coffee sometime now that things were different. Val looked at him for a moment. Not unkindly. She said she didn't think so. He nodded and left. She went back to her coffee. Later she tried to reconstruct what she had actually felt for Jason in those first weeks. He had been easy to talk to. He had caught up with her in a parking lot when it cost him nothing. He had called her Cinderella and meant it as a kindness and then laughed with the room when Mariella made her the joke. That was the full accounting. You can forgive someone entirely and still have no interest in giving them another hour of your time. Cal had figured that out without making a project of it, which meant it had settled into the kind of understanding that doesn't need tending. Her life had changed in almost every measurable way. What remained was something smaller, the part that can't be repaired by circumstance alone. That part was still waiting. She just didn't know yet what for. A few weeks passed. Val settled into the rhythms of the new job, the new apartment, Martin's evolving opinions about cat food. She had started keeping a note in her phone about his preferences. He ate the chicken varieties with straightforward enthusiasm. He approached the turkey ones with a skepticism that bordered on personal offense. The salmon formula with the green label was acceptable. The salmon formula with the blue label, made by the same company with apparently identical ingredients, was an insult. On a Saturday morning in early May, she was in the cat food aisle at PetSmart on Belmont Avenue, crouched in front of the lower shelf comparing 2 cans she hadn't tried yet, when her elbow caught the edge of a row and 3 cans came off at once. She grabbed for the nearest one and missed. A hand came from her left and caught it before it hit the floor. Easy, unhurried, the catch of someone whose reflexes move faster than their thinking. She looked up. The guy holding the can was tall, somewhere in his mid-20s, with an easy stance that suggested he was either very relaxed by nature or very comfortable in his own skin, probably both. He looked at the can, looked at what was in her basket, and said she was buying the good stuff. Val stood up and said her cat had strong feelings about the alternatives. He said he understood completely and held up the can in his other hand, higher-end pull-top, a picture of a genuinely dignified cat on the label. His cat, he said, had essentially the same worldview but applied it to everything, not just food. She asked what kind. Savannah. Named Hendrix. About 14 pounds, deeply convinced of his own importance, cost more than a used car. Val said hers was a purebred alley cat. Very distinguished. Found him in an office supply closet. He laughed, a real one, not a polite one. His name was Archer. Arch mostly. They stood in the cat food aisle longer than made sense given that both of them had already found what they came for, then drifted toward the register, still talking. Then were on the sidewalk, still talking, and at no point did either of them make a decision to keep going. It just kept going. The way a conversation does when both people are paying attention, and neither wants to be the first to let it stop. He walked her home. 11 blocks, 40 minutes, neither of them walking fast. They stood outside her building and kept talking about the neighborhood, about Youngstown, about what it meant to grow up somewhere people were either fiercely loyal to or couldn't wait to leave. And how most people ended up being both at different points in their lives. The streetlight above them flickered once and held. Somewhere down the block a dog barked at something and stopped. It was almost 10 when Val finally said she should go up. Arch said, "Yeah, of course." They both stood there another moment. She went inside. He said goodnight through the glass door. She took the elevator up, fed Martin his dinner an hour late, and sat on the couch replaying the evening in a way she hadn't done about anything in a long time. Somewhere around midnight, she realized neither of them had exchanged numbers. She didn't know his last name. She didn't know where he lived. She put her phone down and told herself it had just been a nice evening, and she went to bed and didn't sleep well. By morning she had mostly convinced herself she'd made more of it than it was. That was the sensible read. A good conversation with a stranger, same direction, home, nothing more. She was not going to be someone who built a thing out of nothing. She got up, made coffee, fed Martin. She was still in her pajamas at 9:15 when something made her go to the window. Arch was leaning against the wall outside her building. Jacket on, hands in his pockets, looking at the street. Not pacing, just there. Val stood at the window for a moment. Then she put on shoes, didn't bother changing, and went downstairs. He straightened up when she came through the door. He said he'd gone home the night before, fed Hendrix, and found he didn't want to stay there. So he'd come back. He said he knew it was a lot showing up like this on a Saturday morning. He knew how it looked. But he hadn't wanted to lose another hour not knowing her, and that was the only way he knew how to say it. Val had spent most of her life bracing for what came next. She'd built it in so deep it had started to feel like just the way she was. Standing on the front step in her pajamas in the May morning sun, looking at this person who had gone home and come back and stood outside in the cold rather than lose track of her. She felt the bracing loosen in a way she didn't entirely know what to do with. She stepped aside and held the door open. She said she had coffee upstairs if he wanted some. He said he did. They went inside together. And Martin, who was an excellent judge of character and had never once been wrong about a person, jumped off the couch when they walked in and went directly to Arch and sat on his foot. Val had almost talked herself out of going to that window. She'd had the whole reasonable argument assembled. She'd nearly believed it. Have you ever done that? Built the perfect case for why something good couldn't possibly be real and almost convinced yourself just in time to miss it.